Good evening. Please be seated. I'd like to start with a short poem from John M.C. Crum, who's an Anglican priest, theologian, and poet. Now the green blade rises from the buried grain, wheat that in dark earth many days has lain. Love lives again, that with the dead has been. Love is come again, like wheat arising green. Tonight we gather to celebrate the Easter Vigil, which is the first service of Easter Day. All four Gospels contain accounts of the resurrection and the empty tomb. Tonight we heard Mark's version. Now I know I've heard this Gospel before, but having to prepare a sermon on the text made me read and think about it carefully. And honestly, as in most of Mark's accounts, there is much to unpack in these very concise verses. Mark's account can be a bit confusing at first read. It is confusing because it is difficult to understand how the story could end in this manner. Did Mark intentionally provide what seems to be an incomplete ending to the resurrection story? The story seemingly ends with a moment of failure and disappointment. But the last line describes the women as fleeing from the tomb in terror, amazement, and out of fear, saying nothing to anyone. What kind of ending is this? However, remember the writer is Mark. Throughout Mark's gospel, we seem to hear that those who are closest to Jesus, who should understand his ministry and tell others about him, just don't get what Jesus is about. Jesus predicts his death, and the disciples appear confused and argue about who will be the greatest in his kingdom. Those who should understand what Jesus is saying and doing just don't get it, and they fail to share the good news. Conversely, those who do understand what Jesus is about and accurately perceive his mission aren't considered credible. The demons cast out by Jesus know who Jesus is and recognize his power, but demons as credible witnesses? David Luce, Lutheran pastor and commentary author, points out that throughout Mark's gospel, the women have proved the most faithful of Jesus' disciples. Some have traveled with him and cared for his needs. They stood at the foot of the cross. But now Mark describes them as too afraid to say anything to anyone. So how do we make sense of Mark's account? Perhaps we need to start at the beginning of the story, at the first verse of Mark's gospel, to truly understand the seemingly abrupt conclusion to this story of the life of the Christ. For Mark's opening sentence to this gospel is as brief and awkward as the closing verse, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Is Mark inviting the reader to pick up the story? Are we now responsible for sharing the good news of the empty tomb? For if it is only the beginning, we do have a part to play. As Christians today, I think the part we are called to play has less to do with the historical case for the empty tomb and more with its meaning, its relevance for us today. Jesuit New Testament scholar Gerald O'Collins frames the issue in the following manner. The difficulty for many people may be with what does it mean rather than did it happen. O'Collins continues focusing on what he posits as the real issue for believers today. What might the empty tomb of Jesus reveal about God and the divine activity on our behalf? To put it simply, how is God made known in the story of death and resurrection of Jesus? And how does it call us to faith and action? If we consider all the events of the last 3 days, O'Collins calls our attention to three notable contrasts contained in Mark's accounts: darkness and light, absence and presence, silence and speech. We have the darkness of the garden, the darkness enveloping the earth at the crucifixion, and the darkness of the tomb, contrasted with the risen sun that accompanies the women to the light-filled tomb. The first revelation we are given is that God overcomes darkness and death. God is able to bring about what is not humanly possible, opening the tomb, which was a source of worry for the women, and raising the dead. The second contrast, absence and presence, occurs when the women enter the tomb. The women came to anoint the dead Jesus, but Jesus is absent. He is risen. Instead, they encounter a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right. Jesus' presence is made known through this angelic messenger. The third contrast, silence and speech, is contained in the angel's message and the women's silent response. From the description of the young man, we can assume that he is an angel. Shining white robes are the traditional clothing of heavenly messengers. O'Collins calls our attention to the manner in which the message is delivered by the young man. The angel remains seated and speaks with authority. This posture is in keeping with how Old Testament judgments were delivered. The women respond with amazement, even alarm, which seems to be understandable and somewhat the standard reaction to a visit from an angel. The angel tries to allay their fears by reassuring them, "Do not be alarmed," advising them that Jesus is risen, and giving them a message for the apostles. So the encounter ends with the amazing but confident words of the angels, contrasted with the silence and flight from the tomb of the women. So how are we to interpret this ending? Some commentaries suggest that Mark's account ends with human failure and collapse. Pastor Luce sees it as a call to action for the followers of Jesus today. The Jesuit scholar O'Connell suggests that we need to more closely examine the behavior of the women in the account. He notes that the women remained true to Jesus to the end, even coming to the tomb to complete the required burial rites. He suggests a careful reading of the entire Gospel of Mark demonstrates that over and over, the response to what Jesus says and does is met with alarm, silence, fear, amazement, and even terror. Jesus' teachings and miracles are meant to manifest that God is among us. O'Collins notes that wonder, amazement, fear, terror, and astonishment are the proper human reactions to the presence and power of God. But how do we make sense of the silence and the flight from the tomb by the women? O'Collins suggests that perhaps we need to again understand these reactions as appropriate human responses. He suggests such responses are not failures of faith, but are consistent with divine revelations and manifestations. Silence, he notes, is often the initial response to a divine encounter. Perhaps we should see the initial silence of the women as temporary. The message will be delivered to the apostles, as they did eventually go to Galilee. The women's response is in keeping with the angel's message and to the climax of divine revelation, which has occurred in Jesus' resurrection. O'Collins summarizes Mark's verses as God has triumphed over evil, the divine kingdom is breaking into the world, and the victimized Jesus is finally vindicated as the Son of God. Mark's verses can give us much to reflect upon. And just as the women did at the tomb, perhaps this evening we should take some time to wonder and discern what the awesome and amazing gift of the Christ's resurrection means for us today. As Pastor Luce points out, Jesus' resurrection isn't a conclusion, it is an invitation. It is an invitation to continue Jesus' mission. If we accept Jesus' call to continue his mission, there is much still to be done. Locally, we continue to deal with the lack of affordable housing and some of the highest property taxes in the United States. Nationally, there's an issue of rising food costs, attempts at controlling women's management of their own bodies, and increasing xenophobia and transphobia. Internationally, war continues on multiple fronts. The effects of climate change impact the world food supply, and there is increased flooding and wildfires. And of great concern is the continued rise of fascism. If you ever wonder why there is still so much pain, anguish, and distress in the world, it's because the work begun by Jesus has not been completed. Mark tells us it is only the beginning. We are called to continue the work with the marginalized, to comfort the sick and dying, to work against the forces that create and perpetuate injustices. We are to share the good news of Jesus, which in his words, actions, death, and resurrection demonstrate that there is triumph over injustice and death. It is only the beginning. Amen.